Good afternoon, everyone. My name is Mark Nordenberg. In earlier lives, I served as dean of this law school and as chancellor of this university. Today, I'm privileged to serve both as chair of Pitt's Institute of Politics and director of its Dick Thornburgh Forum for Law and Public Policy. I extend those greetings not just for myself, but also for the former First Lady of Pennsylvania, Ginny Thornburgh, who normally would be in the front row, but who is recovering from knee replacement surgery, and so is with us online, as is her distinguished son, David. I also extend these greetings on behalf of Samantha Balbier, who is the director of the Institute of Politics. And I do extend them not only to the people gathered here in the moot courtroom, but also to the 200 people who are joining us through our live stream. Samantha, who I mentioned a moment ago, was principally responsible for a terrific Institute of Politics program that we had late yesterday afternoon. It was for students only. It featured David Green, who is or was the longtime host of the morning edition on NPR, and now is responsible for the Left, Right, Center podcast. Among other things, he led a discussion involving 4 students: the president of the College Democrats, the president of the College Republicans, the president of the Political Science Students Association, and the president of Bridge Pitt. And the focus of that discussion was the forces that make having a civil conversation about difficult issues so hard these days and what we can do about that. And I will say, as is so often true of Pitt students, they were just shining as examples of the university as they discussed their own experiences and shared their ideas. And so I do want to say I'm glad to see some familiar student faces in the audience today. Come back, bring your friends. These are, I think, thought-provoking programs, and our future really is in your hands. So we're particularly happy when we see you here. Let me also say we've got some very distinguished faculty members, members of the university staff, committed citizens, and community leaders here today, and we welcome all of you. Dick Thornburgh, of course, had really an extraordinary career. Dick Thornburgh, I should say, a graduate of this law school, had an extraordinary career. Among his positions, he served as United States Attorney for the Western District of Pennsylvania, as Assistant Attorney General in charge of the Department of Justice's Criminal Division, as a 2-term governor of Pennsylvania, as United States Attorney General under 2 different presidents, President Reagan and the first President Bush, and also as Undersecretary General of the United Nations. Even more important than the positions that he held was the good that he consistently did in each of them. To give just 2 significant examples, in the very early weeks of his first term as Pennsylvania's governor, he faced the issue of the meltdown at 3 Mile Island's nuclear plant, and really earned a national reputation, I think, for the professional, measured, thoughtful way in which he handled that potential disaster. much later in his career, serving as Attorney General for President George Herbert Walker Bush. He was the point person for the administration in securing passage of the Americans with Disabilities Act. And sandwiched between those bookends were many, many other important contributions to the people of Pennsylvania and to the people of the country. Dick believed that there was no higher calling than public service. He was a highly principled leader who unfailingly extended courtesy and respect to others. He believed in marshaling the evidence, not only as a prosecutor, but in all of the positions that he held. And he was a champion of democracy and the rule of law. So the Dick Thornburgh Forum has always had a special focus on governance issues. I can't even begin to count the number of programs we've sponsored that fit within that general category. Past speakers have included journalists and judges, prosecutors, politicians, and professors. But until now, we never have had a professor of democracy. We break through that barrier today as we welcome Professor J. Russell Muirhead, who is the Robert Clements Professor of Democracy and Politics at Dartmouth. Professor Muirhead earned both his undergraduate degree and his PhD from Harvard. He also has a degree from Oxford, which he earned as a Rhodes Scholar. Before moving to Dartmouth, he held faculty appointments at Williams College, Harvard, and the University of Texas at Austin. He also is co-director of Dartmouth's Political Economy Project and has served as interim director of the Rockefeller Institute on Public Policy at Dartmouth and as chair of the Department of Government at Dartmouth. As if that was not enough, in 2020, he sought election to the New Hampshire House of Representatives and won, and he still holds that seat. Though he was raised in New Hampshire, Professor Muirhead has strong and important ties to Western Pennsylvania, particularly the communities of Indiana and Du Bois, through his grandparents. And he has told me that as a boy, his parents would put him on a plane to Pittsburgh. His grandparents would meet him at the airport, and he would spend time here in the region that we call home and love. In October of 2024, the Princeton University Press published Ungoverning, the attack on the administrative state and the politics of chaos, a book that was co-authored by Professor Muirhead and Nancy Rosenblum, the Senator Joseph Clark Professor of Ethics in Politics and Government Emerita at Harvard. E.J. Dionne described the book in this way: Ungoverning is an essential book for our moment, starting with a title that deserves to be a touchstone in our political conversation, brilliantly drawing together philosophical reflections on democracy's obligations to its citizens with a lively, practical sense of how government works. Its authors offer a passionate defense of the now contested work of making our society fairer, safer, and more responsive. Please join me in welcoming Professor J. Russell Muirhead to the University of Pittsburgh.
Thank you. Thank you, Mark, for that warm, that lovely introduction. I'm almost impressed with myself listening to it, but I know better. And I'm delighted to be here, and I'm honored to be here, and I'm also delighted and honored by your presence. Thank you for coming. I'd like to talk a little bit today about what's happening in American politics and try to situate what's happening, which I think is very disorienting, in a way that allows us to diagnose it from a perspective that reaches a little further than the perspective of the partisan. I am, in practical politics, a partisan. If you're going to run for office, you can run as independent. Most of us run as Democrats or Republicans. And when you're a partisan, your interpretation of politics goes something like this. My side is 100% right, and sooner or later, the people are going to figure that out. And that, so you're diagnosed what's wrong with our politics, so just blaming the other side. Well, there's a certain amount of truth, and sometimes a lot of truth in the perspective of the partisan. But it doesn't really capture the whole truth, and I don't think it really diagnoses our situation right now in a particularly incisive way. We're seeing two things right now. Two things go on simultaneously: a policy revolution, an amazing and disorienting policy revolution, and a dismantling of governmental institutions at the same moment. The policy revolution itself, just look at that for a second, is astonishing. We're seeing a reversal of about a 70-year commitment to free trade policies in the United States. We're seeing a reversal of a commitment to liberal immigration policies that goes back to legislation passed in 1965. So a 60-year commitment to relatively liberal immigration policies. We're seeing a real disruption in our foreign policy. And in the posture toward, say, countries like Ukraine and the war between Russia and Ukraine that would have been habitual during the many decades of the Cold War. That habitual posture is being disrupted. We're seeing possibly a reversal, at least an interruption, of about 50 years of what I call sort of liberal social policy. Muirhead's argument to Archie Bunker that women should be equal to men in social life, in economic life, that argument won. Muirhead won, Archie Bunker lost. I recently entertained Michael Pence, former vice president, the Honorable Michael Pence at Dartmouth College, and he was bragging a little bit about his daughter who had recently graduated from Yale Law School. And I thought, wow, if we're living in a world where a principled conservative, a Christian conservative, a biblical conservative like Michael Pence, a traditionalist in many respects, is on Muirhead's side when it comes to educating women for careers, we're in a different place than we were in. And that logic of equality was extended not just to women, but also to places people maybe couldn't imagine. By the way, All in the Family is a sitcom that played in the 1970s. You should watch them. Extended to same-sex couples with respect to marriage. When I was an undergraduate, unthinkable. The Bowers case is passed when I'm an undergraduate, Bowers v. Hardwick, decided by the Supreme Court, which legalizes states' formal and legal discrimination against gay couples. And so the application of this logic of equality is same-sex marriage, and then in more, since 2012, to transsexuals is a kind of a consistent course. That trajectory has been interrupted. Many of my students think reversed that we're looking at the beginnings of a reversal. So whether for foreign policy, social policy, domestic policy, trade policy, a massive policy revolution, an astonishing and disorienting policy revolution. I say disorienting because take trade policy. I mean, it's, for instance, just, this policy revolution will be cheered and celebrated by some. Supporters of the administration presumably are happy with this, but opponents of the administration alarmed by it. But it's not as simple as just conservative policies versus liberal policies. It's such a revolution. I'm not even sure which side is which anymore. The trade policies run by or pursued by this presumably conservative administration have more in common with the trade policy preferences of Bernie Sanders than they do with the trade policy preferences of Ronald Reagan. Are these conservative? So it's a very disorienting time. It's a policy revolution that's comprehensive, astonishing, disorienting. And alongside that policy revolution is another thing going on, a systematic attack on governmental institutions, in particular, the part of government that does all the work government does. The part of government that's referred to, oh, I have a book in the back of the room. You can get up during my talk and buy a copy if you want to. I won't be upset. But in the subtitle of the book, there's a subtitle that says "The Attack on the Administrative State." And when Nancy and I were titling the book, we thought to ourselves, we can't put the term administrative state in the title of a book. The only people who understand what that term means are law professors. And even they largely go to sleep when they hear it. So we can't put the administrative state. Well, now we all kind of know what it is, but it's the part of government that does everything you expect, everything citizens expect government to do. If you expect the government to respond to people who have lost everything after a hurricane, after a storm, what does it? It's the administrative state that does that. In civics, in 8th grade civics, you learn about government, you learn about governmental institutions, you learn about how the Constitution works, you learn about, Congress and how a bill becomes a law, and it gets passed, it gets signed by the president, and there's a bill. And that's where the story stops in 8th grade civics. What happens after a bill is passed? How does that bill make any difference in the world? Does it just get put in a filing cabinet? Here's the filing cabinet of bills. Well, for any bill to make for any law, once it's signed and passed and duly enrolled, for any law to do anything in the world, you need now something else. You can pass bills that say, let there be an interstate highway system. Nothing will get built unless you have a massive, I hate to use the word, bureaucracy that that marshals resources, that organizes capacities, that makes something happen on the street, in the road, and in the woods, in the country. So the attack right now on governmental institutions isn't an abstract attack. It's an attack on the part of government that does the stuff government does. It's an attack on the administrative state. And to make that a little bit more concrete, the administrative state includes, this is the part that's most understandable. Most of it's pretty invisible in the administrative state. When just backing up to 8th grade civics, when you learn civics in 8th grade, you see the House of Representatives, 435 people. You see the Senate, 100 people. You see the president, one great person. You see a vice president, another great people. What's my tally up to? 537? And you see 9 Supreme Court justices. So roughly, I'm just rounding up, about 550 people. You see about 550 people. That's the United States government when you take civics. Well, there are 2 million more people in the government, drawing paychecks, doing stuff. They're the ones doing the work of government. And they include the part that you might know, maybe not 8th grade, maybe this would be 10th grade, is the cabinet. The president has a cabinet. And the cabinet secretaries show up in the White House, and they're in the cabinet room, and there are 15 cabinet departments. So add another 15 people to the picture of government. Cabinet departments. There is actually a kind of attack on these traditional cabinet departments. Massive amounts of firing, as we saw. An invitation early in the year for every single civil servant working in any agency, in any department of government, to resign. We want you to resign. We don't want you, was the message from the new administration. We don't want you here. We don't want your work. We don't want your expertise. We don't want your experience. We will give you a bunch of months of free pay if you quit. And there's even acute attack, not just on the Justice Department, which I don't think has any more lawyers in it right now. I just read a story yesterday that there are very few, I don't know if the graduates of this law school are keen to apply, but there are lots of openings. Somebody said, it's as if anyone who's held a football can be a quarterback. Come, be our quarterback on the team. They're desperate for lawyers in the Justice Department. That's not where it's the only place where it is. It's also in the independent agencies of government. And these are really, really weird things constitutionally. Because if you open the Constitution, you'll see Article 1, there's a legislature. Article 2, that's the executive. Article 3, those are where the courts, those are where the judges are. That's the Supreme Court. There are a few more articles tidying up things. But there's no article that says, here are the independent agencies. We need some agencies that are kind of independent of both Congress and the president, that house, people with subject-specific expertise, and that apply that expertise to public problems. There's nothing in the Constitution about independent agencies. Independent agencies are set up by Congress, but they're set up to be independent of Congress. They're set up to be independent of the executive, so that a president in principle can't come in and say, I want to fire everybody in the Federal Reserve. I want to appoint my people to the Federal Reserve. And when I want to decide what our interest rates are. The whole idea of a central bank is that there are bankers and economists deciding on interest rates, balancing inflation against growth to come up with the highest sustainable non-inflationary growth rate, interest rate, and make that decision in a way that's independent of the political incentives of elected officials. If you're in office and you're an executive, you probably want low interest rates. You probably want to goose the economy. You probably want growth. Let the inflation happen later, you'll worry about that. Inflation's a lagged effect. The immediate effect is growth. So in order to guard against that very, very predictable political incentive, we create an independent agency, a Federal Reserve, staffed by experts that can make decisions about interest rates without a view to whether it's going to harm the incumbent president, regardless of what party that president's from. And same truth, Securities and Exchange Commission, Federal Trade Commission, Federal Communication Commission. There are Wikipedia. There are an amazing number of independent agencies. And the attack right now in government institutions is focused on those. That's ground zero of the attack, not just cabinet departments. And so that's what's happening. Right now we have a policy revolution and an attack on the part of government that does most of the work government does. And do I need to point out, those two things are in enormous tension. And I'll just point out very briefly, this is one place where the tension comes into super crisp focus. Look at the Department of Education. On one hand, the current administration has told the Department of Education, we want you to collect a range of data on college admissions from universities that you haven't collected in the past, because we would like to enforce non-discrimination laws as we interpret them on universities in a more aggressive way. That's exactly what you'd expect a government to do. That's exactly what you'd expect. You may like that policy, you may deplore that policy, that's a further question, but you'd expect elected officials to get and say, I have policy priorities. I'm going to use the part of government that makes government happen, that gets stuff done, to execute on those policy priorities. I'm going to ask my Secretary of Education to gather the data that we need to execute on the policy priorities that I have. It's exactly what you'd expect. Well, the same administration asked the same Secretary of Education to shut down the Department of Education with all due speed, to eliminate it. If you eliminate the Department of Education can't gather the data that you want to gather to implement your policy. So that's just a place where the policy revolution and the attack, what I call ungoverning, the attack on governmental institutions come into an obvious kind of contradiction. And what I'd say is, regardless, you may think of yourself as conservative, you may think of yourself as liberal, presumably, you may think of yourself as centrist. Regardless, presumably you have policies, goals you'd like to see the country pursue. And if you do, you're going to need governmental institutions to successfully prosecute those goals. And And if you destroy those institutions, if you hobble the ability of government to do anything, it's going to be very hard to succeed, whether you're liberal, conservative, or centrist, or some interesting mix of the three. And so the question is, why? Why would any elected administration go after the institution? Why would any coalition support destroying, ungoverning? Why would they support destroying governmental institutions? Why would you, I mean, most of the time you think about like even, I don't know, radicals, centrists, whatever, Marxists, they want to take over the state because they want to use the state to impose Marxist policies. Liberals want it, conservatives want that. Why would you undo the state as such? And I think that's a really, that question gets at the kind of disorientation that the contemporary moment of our politics leaves us with. I think the point of ungoverning is to create a new kind of power in our government, a kind of power that actually the Constitution was meant to proscribe or forbid. A power of personal decree. A power whereby one person can say, let it be done, and it's done. A power of personal command. I mean, the whole idea of a constitution is to take that kind of power, which we normally associate with kind of absolute monarch, and subject it to the discipline of constitutionalism, of settled rules, of processes. And so I think it's not just wanton destruction. It's not totally chaotic. It's not a totally chaotic attack on governmental capacity. It's an attack on the policy state, on the capacity of government to describe long-term goals, create and gather the kind of data or information you need to figure out how to pursue long-term goals effectively, gather the kinds of enormous resources you need to pursue them successfully, and create strategies or policies to bring the data and the resources together to reach those goals. That's a policy state. It's very much at the heart of the capacity to develop policies and pursue them was really developed. It's a creature of the New Deal. It's developed in the 20th century. And many of these independent agencies that are so important to developing policies are creatures of the 20th century, though they were invented in the late 1800s and developed a little bit in the progressive era in the first decade or so of the 20th century. Really, it's a creature. But this idea that this is what government should do goes back to the founding. This is Hamilton's idea. Hamilton uses this word in the Federalist, administration. It's his favorite word. And he knows, he uses administration, he's talking about it when I'm talking about when I say policy state. And when he serves in the first Washington administration as the Secretary of Treasury, the first thing he does is gather data. And when you gather data, you create data. He creates data on the condition of the American economy. It's called the Report on Manufactures. And he's trying to figure out his strategy, his goal, his long-term goal is, how do we move from a subsistence agrarian economy where most people's labor just doesn't produce that much, and most people are hungry, to an economy that's more diversified, where we have more manufacturing, where the value created by every hour of human beings' labor, including the labor of women and children even, is just vastly greater than it is in an agrarian economy. How do we do that? How would we move from here to there? And he's thinking of different policy tools, tariff. He's thinking about bounties or kind of like using the government as a venture fund to fund new manufacturing enterprises. He's thinking about how to move us from here to there. A national bank proves very controversial. So the policy state goes right back to the founding, as opposed to the power of decree. Washington saying, let there be manufacturers. Do what it takes. So why would we create this power of decree, this power of personal command? Why would we want to ungovern in order to create this? And I'm going to gesture sort of quickly to a few reasons. One, it can be extraordinarily gratifying to the person who possesses this power. Abraham Lincoln, in the first speech he ever gave, 1838, in the dusty streets of Springfield, a no man, a nothing. I mean, no one knows Abraham Lincoln's name. They have a lyceum. It's this thing where people get together and they try to give speeches and prove each other. It's like a town level book club. They have a speaking contest. He comes, he gives his first speech ever. It's on how to perpetuate the political constitution, the new constitution. It's about 50 years old. And he says, the biggest threat, in the concluding paragraphs of the talk, the biggest threat to the perpetuation of our constitution is that there will grow up certain people who are so ambitious, who thirst and burn for distinction, that they would not be satisfied just merely being a professor of biochemistry, a partner in a law firm, a congresswoman, even a chancellor. They want more. They want more. They want to be seen and known by all. They want to be remembered forever. And they'll do what it takes to gratify that ambition. And often that means destruction. They will destroy a constitution if that's what it takes. Be on guard. Understand this problem. So this is Lincoln. This is something that happens. This is something we need to be prepared for. That kind of ambition, this kind of decree, this kind of power, this kind of destruction can be very satisfying. But it's not just that. It's not like there's just one person behind it, one amazingly fascinating, brilliant, and ambitious person. It's also, there's a constitutional doctrine that invites this ungoverning. It's a doctrine called the unitary executive theory. Can anyone Google for me? You probably don't have. If you have your device out and you're shopping, can you Google the first sentence of Article 2 of the Constitution? Can you do that for me? First sentence of Article 2 of the Constitution. Just give me a signal. Raise your hand when you have it. And this power says that the independent agencies, the thing about what makes them, the way that they're independent is the president can't remove all the people on these agencies all at once and replace them with his or her people. And so you got it? First sentence, can you read it for us?
The executive power shall be vested in the President of the United States.
The executive power, thank you so much, will be vested in A, and that's a critical article, A, President of the United States. It doesn't say it'll be vested in an executive office. It doesn't say in an office of the presidency. It doesn't say in a bureaucracy. It doesn't say it'll be spread around a bunch of different commissions, and a president. And so conservative opponents of sort of New Deal liberalism and the New Deal state that Roosevelt built have been upset about, in a way, these independent agencies, upset about their constitutional status. And I don't think it's entirely a political ideological argument. It's also kind of a constitutional argument that they don't have any founding, any basis in the Constitution. I think Justice Roberts is very undecided on the constitutional standing of these independent agencies. And there's a court case that I think will be heard. It goes back to the New Deal. By the way, the other very ambitious president who didn't like these independent agencies was Franklin Roosevelt. He wanted to fire all the people in the Federal Trade Commission and replace them with his people who are more friendly to his policy agenda. And it was litigated, and the court said, you can't do that. And that case is known as Humphrey's Executor. And it sort of validated the constitutional, am I getting it right or not? Yeah, okay, right, exactly. So, that case, Humphrey's Executor, is up for grabs. I mean, it's going to be relitigated this year. So that's the second reason. Gratification, other unitary executive. And I think though, behind those, there's another reason, which is the idea that only I can fix it. And it's not just an individual assertion. It's actually a doctrine that the kinds of problems that we have as a country are such that we can no longer rely on the tools of policy to get the change people want and to get the change people need. And I think back to the moment in 2008, I'll confess I was opposed to the invasion of Iraq in March 23. And in the 2008 presidential election, I was supporting candidates who were really much more opposed to the invasion. And in the Democratic Party, I understood that to be Barack Obama rather than Hillary Clinton, who had voted for the authorization of force that legitimated the invasion of Iraq. And Barack Obama, as you know, was elected. And I was expecting a massive change. I was expecting that we would leave Iraq. get the troops out of Iraq. We got no change. We got no change, I would argue. I'm not going to get into the details there, but he did keep George W. Bush's Secretary of Defense for the first 2 years of administration and ran roughly the same defense policy. You could credit him for that. This is a great country. We don't want to change our foreign policy and become very volatile in our commitments. You could make an argument in defense of him. But for a lot of us who wanted policy change, we were frustrated that we didn't get it. And I think his successor, who also wanted, his successor, though from the other party, elected in 2016, also wanted a change, also was against the invasion of Iraq. And his successor was very frustrated by the Department of Defense. And so if you want policy change, you can't do it through policy. If you want to change, the free trade policies in the WTO, if you want to change agreements, say free trade between Canada and Mexico, can we do it using the tools of policy? It's going to be so slow moving. The bureaucrats will gum it up. The vested interests will figure out how to prevent this change from happening. And it's even more so. Imagine you're conservative, maybe some of you are, with respect to cultural issues. How do you overturn this sort of trajectory? How do you interrupt the trajectory of egalitarianism brought to different spheres of social life and personal identity, as I was describing earlier? How do you check that using policy? You might need to create this kind of personal power to get change. And I think that's the real reason. That's why it's not just about one person. That's why it's about a certain kind of deeper frustration with our ability as citizens to make change. And I'll just say behind that is, I think, this longer term frustration with the institutions of constitutional democracy. Nobody your age believes in Congress. Nobody your age is thinking, it's so exciting what might happen in Congress. Like if we can elect, different people from a different party, it could be so cool. What could happen could be so cool. Let's make it happen. And nobody believes in the House of Representatives of the United States of America. Nobody. Nobody believes in the Senate of the United States of America. Nobody believes in Article 1, which is Article 1 because the founders expected it would be the most democratic branch, the most powerful branch, the most passionate branch, the branch with the biggest just force of motion. Nobody believes in that branch anymore. And nobody really believes that we can use the tools of electoral democracy to get change, to renovate the world, to repair the world. Maybe we can use it to stop something we don't like. But are we really, the phrase of the 28 campaign, does anyone really believe that hope, it's almost laughable to say, yes, we can. And that is the crisis, that's the slow-moving constitutional crisis that sets us up for ungoverning. Let's not blame one person and say if there were just not this one person, everything would be different. Let's acknowledge what's going on with our constitutional democracy. And I just want to close with a couple words about the Constitution and what it does and how we need to listen to what it whispers in our ears. The Constitution of the United States is a very curious thing because it's both empowering and disempowering. It empowers. Its opening sentence, we, the people, do ordain, we the people, in order to form a more perfect union, establish justice, ensure domestic tranquility, provide for the common defense, promote the general welfare, secure the blessings of liberty for ourselves and our posterity, do ordain and establish this Constitution of the United States of America. That's the first sentence of the Constitution. Mrs. Kelly, my 8th grade English teacher at Hillside Junior High School, Manchester, New Hampshire, had me diagram 900 sentences. And I know you don't do that anymore, but we had to figure out what the subject of the sentence was and what the verb of the sentence was. Never mind all the dependent clauses, prepositional phrases, and blah, blah, blah. And if you do that to this sentence, you come out with this subject, we, and this verb, do. We do. We do ordain and establish. And we do because there's a lot of things we want to do. We want to form. We want to secure. We want to, we want to maintain. We want to create. There's so many things we want to do. We do. The Constitution is meant to empower us. But then it also disempowers us. It fragments popular will across two branches of the legislature. The 1776 Pennsylvania Constitution, one of the first constitutions after the Declaration of Independence, one branch. They said, we want a democracy, why do we need two branches? We don't have an upper class. One branch of the legislature, they changed that. But that's the way, in a sense, the UK is now. That's the way Nebraska is now. But we don't do that in the federal Constitution. We have two branches. Why? So that makes it harder. Division, just the old separation of powers. Everyone loves checks and balances. Checks and balances makes it hard for the popular voice to be heard. It makes it hard for the people to do anything. And the administrative state, which I've just said, does everything government does, makes it all real in the world, also makes it hard to do things. So we have the Constitution, which promises empowerment, it also often ends up disempowering people. Unless you listen carefully to what it whispers in your ears. And there have been very few people who have been able, I don't think anyone's listening to it anymore, but some did. Some figured out how to use the Constitution to empower the people. And the first to do that was Thomas Jefferson. Thomas Jefferson didn't just run for president, he created a coalition around him that would elect people who shared his public philosophy, who shared his view to the House, elect a majority to the Senate. Not just once, but twice. Not just twice, 6 times. That's right, Thomas Jefferson was president for 24 years. Little known fact. Because Madison and Monroe were Jeffersonians. They agreed with him. It was almost as if he kept running. Another person who did that, FDR. Now, FDR does actually get elected 4 times, but he continues getting elected after. I would argue that he was continuing to get elected when Eisenhower was president. He was president in 1964, long after he died, when LBJ wins the election. Because New Deal Democrats get elected over and over and over again to the presidency. New Deal Democrats get elected to the House. New Deal Democrats get elected to the Senate. Majorities, the Roosevelt rules in an almost uninterrupted way from 1932 to 1968. And the remnants of his great, large, and lasting coalition continue to get elected to Congress, arguably up until 1994. That's how you make the Constitution work. You create a huge coalition, a large coalition, a geographically dispersed coalition, a deeply diverse coalition that shares a general point of view, a general orientation, and you use that coalition to get elected over and over and over and over while you're alive and after you're dead. Nobody's been able to do that in my lifetime, and I am not a young man. No one's been able to do that. No one's been able to create that coalition since the New Deal coalition fragmented in the late 60s, early 70s. I'm worried that now nobody's even trying. You know, my colleagues say, it's like, oh, what if we change this law? Will our opponents not quite be able to get, get ballots? Will they not be able to file absentee ballots? If we change this, make it a little harder for them. If we don't do mail-in ballots, will that help us out? And I always say when in the legislature, I tell my friends who are trying to tweak the law, I think to make it a little bit harder for their opponents to vote. I say, Ronald Reagan didn't worry about disenfranchising people on the margin. He said, I've got a great public philosophy. It's called conservatism. I'm going to bring it to the people. I'm going to persuade people. He won 49 states. That's what the Constitution asks you to do. Ronald Reagan was on it. LBJ was on it. They knew that this Constitution asks us to form a large and lasting coalition and a diverse coalition. That's what we have to do. That's what our leaders have to do. I don't know if they're trying anymore. What can we do right now? What can we do? I'm going to give us two quick suggestions. 1, resist. 2, join. Those 2 things are in tension. Resist, join. 1, we have to resist. As just individuals, we have to resist purification rituals. There's this tendency now to think of political parties as religious sects. And when someone's in your party who doesn't share your views about something you think is, really important, that you're pretty sure you're right about, to exile them from your party. I've been getting these emails all the while I'm traveling out here to Pittsburgh from my local Democratic committee, which I serve on, about how we have to, condemn our senator because she voted to reopen the government. Well, we could disagree with her, but, do we have to condemn her? Maybe she has a good argument. Let's let that argument in. We're a political party. We're not a church. And so we resist purification rituals. I think the classic, in the Democratic Party was when they ran Al Franken out of the party. I'm not saying Al Franken's a perfect man. He's a comedian. How could he be a perfect man? But, maybe we could have had that in the party. Second, join. We're very, very bad at forming coalitions in our politics today. We're very bad at forming diverse coalitions where people belong to the same thing, even though they don't all think the same way. Resist purification rituals, but join. Join something. Join a group. Join a face-to-face group. Join a book club. Have people over for dinner. Join a bird-watching group. Join a dance group. Join something. Get away from the screen and join something where you're in a group with other human beings. You'll find out that they don't agree with you about lots of things, and you'll find out that you can live with them and love them anyway. That's the skill we need to make the Constitution work. I'll stop there.
With that kind of applause, maybe we should stop there. Let me say that there were pieces of paper and pens circulated or placed on chairs before the program began. If you've got a question, write it down, send it toward the center aisle, and we'll get it up here, and I'll kind of be the traffic director. And let me ask you this, because I do think the one question that has dominated those that were sent in with registrations was, what should we do? And can you be a little bit more specific or offer some ideas that are connected to the politics of the day? Specific questions that were asked, for example, included, what do you think of the No Kings marches? If you have ideas.
Yeah, so first, like I said, I'm part of this little small Democratic group that's writing letters condemning the senator from New Hampshire for being one of the people who signed on to the agreement to reopen the government. I like the letter and I like the senator. Mm-hmm. And so I think part of it is just cultivating this sort of acceptance that we're going to disagree with each other. And so, yeah, the No Kings rally, anything that gets, what I love about the No Kings stuff isn't so much, I think it's kind of fun, it seems, but it's that people are out there in person, holding signs, hanging out, talking to each other. And yeah, they're united in opposition, but they're actually, if you scratch the surface, they're not necessarily that united. They don't agree with each other about everything. So I love that. But here's the thing, I'm going to be a little bit abstract again. Here's the thing I think we need in our politics. I think what I'm worried about, I mentioned, political parties aren't churches. I'm worried that we're becoming more extreme forms of what we already are. Most people actually do lean kind of left or right. Most people have a kind of more somewhat conservative disposition, liberal disposition. Doesn't necessarily describe how they vote, but and I worry that people take their leaning and then work it out in a very, very extreme way. To form the kind of coalition that I think our politics need, you have to mix left and right. You have to start with what you are, and then you have to look over to the other side and ask yourself, what do they know that our side usually forgets? And I actually would commend back in the day George W. Bush. He's a conservative, and he's looking around. He's like, what do the liberals tend to know that we conservatives tend not to know? And he's like, you know what they tend to get pretty good? Compassion. I want some of that. Give me some of that. I'm going to be compassionate conservative. And I think that's exactly the right instinct. That's exactly the right instinct. And so it's, yes, those are intention, they don't fit together, but we need a politics that tries to be more whole. And I think we can do that in ourselves. It's a personal project. and it's a political project. So you say, what can we do? I think you can cultivate that within you. You can cultivate that in your own conversation, in your own relationships. And I think the more of us who do that, the more likely it is that we will change the world.
Well, it's interesting when you talk about condemnation, and I think about the discussion with the students yesterday afternoon, and then I think about the chat we had over breakfast where we were talking about a letter that began with the words, "We demand," and just how far that was going to get.
Right.
When you're really not in a position to demand anything.
We demand.
What do you think, or what might you say about the use of force or the threats of use of force in domestic life, whether that is through law enforcement agencies or the military?
When Nancy and I published this book, we published this book on governing before the election. So I just want to remind you, that means we didn't know who was going to win the election. And a lot of people had different views on that. I do have to say, the book has been, in many respects, I'd say sort of validated more powerfully than we ever expected it would in just maybe the span of 6 months or so. And I think that, one of the chapters in the book is called violence. And when Nancy and I were bringing this book to press, I really asked myself, did we kind of lose our equilibrium? Are we letting our minds run to the worst case scenarios and then writing a book as if that's what's going to happen? And I thought, well, we're just political theorists. Sometimes you have to follow out a certain logic of ideas and see where it goes and describe that to people just so they can identify the logic too and maybe help us not go there. I really would have thought that it was, that it was just kind of an exaggeration to think that we might descend into violence. And now I'm really, now I'm genuinely more concerned than ever about it. It relates to what I'm talking about, this ability to be in groups where you disagree, to hold yourself in a relationship with people who don't have the same views as you do about things you think are really important, where you think you have great reasons to support your own convictions. The more we give up on that project of living together with other people we don't, that we can't persuade, the more tempted we are going to be to kill other people. And I don't want to be too blunt about it, but I do worry very much about that. The alternative persuasion is violence.
Could stop and let that sink in for a moment. And I will say again that the discussion we had last night, I was really surprised at what a high percentage of it was focused on the assassination of Charlie Kirk. And how people reacted to that and what that meant for our system.
Yeah, I mean, and so that wasn't just the assassination of a single person, an extraordinary person in many respects. It was a kind of act of violence against what he stood for. He insisted on going into these institutions like Dartmouth College, where there are very few people who think the way he does, and debating. And it wasn't the most, highfalutin debate in the world. It was a kind of entertaining debate, but he sat there to death. I mean, he did this at Dartmouth years ago before he was a well-known guy. He sat at a little card table in the middle of campus and just debated with anyone who wanted to drop by. And then it wasn't necessarily being filmed or posted or anything. He was just doing it. So someone who's so committed to this idea of debate and exchange of reasons is killed as if there's no point to exchange reasons. That's truly chilling.
You talked about the general loss of faith in government and its ability to get things done. What chance is there to recover from that, particularly in the wake of the destruction of institutions that is going on now?
Yeah, I mean, so, you think about something like the Justice Department and the law school. I mean, one of the things, Justice Department lawyers make a lot less than lawyers in private practice. The benefits that you get when you work for the Justice Department is you get to serve the public and deploy your talents toward public things, which has a kind of nobility to it. You also get job security. And what we've seen now is that promise of job security eviscerated. So I think it's going to take a long, long time to convince cohorts of young people coming of age to devote their careers to public service. And just on that basis alone, on that very just rational basis, well, if I do this and I get a lower salary than I would doing something else for 10 years, and I undercut I don't develop the sorts of skills I might need to thrive in private practice, and then I get fired when there's a new administration, I'm not going to take that. I'm not going to do that, even if it is noble and even if. So I think it's going to require very, very conscious efforts to rebuild and a very bipartisan effort to rebuild. I mean, we're going to have to figure out how to bring the parties together toward a project of rehabilitating government and governmental institutions independent of let's say, the ideological character of the policies that they implement.
I'm not sure if this is contrary to what you're just suggesting. And the question was really posed in terms of Republicans and Democrats. Let me put it a different way. Should those who believe in government and the institutions of government be developing their own version of a Project 2025 so that people are ready to do the difficult things that will have to be done if the pendulum swings?
That's a great idea, Mark. That's a great idea. And but again, I think I would differentiate between both the partisan project. If the pendulum swings and a different party comes into power in a comprehensive way, it's going to need a plan. But I think there also needs to be beyond that an effort to bring the country together behind breathing life back into our governmental institutions. It's really dismaying to me that one of the most extraordinary governmental successes of my lifetime, which a Republican president was responsible for, is something that is widely unappreciated, and that's Project Warp Speed. And in the midst of the pandemic, when everything is shut down, I'm reading from immunologists that we may never get vaccines that can provide some level of immunity or resistance to COVID. And within 6 months, because of very, very extraordinary and innovative kind of advanced purchase contract policy, a number of companies were successfully incented to develop these vaccines, and we had them by December 2020. And then the government distributes them for free to every citizen who wants one within 5 months. This, by May 2021. And this is something that my own, as it happens, political opponents, I feel, should be taking enormous credit for. It's an extraordinary success. And it's really dispiriting to me that they're not proud of their own success. So I think we need to tell the stories about how government does succeed and how it can succeed in addition to rebuilding institutions of government.
Are there particular policies or values, perhaps, that you think would be coalescing factors in developing the kind of broad-based, geographically dispersed coalition?
The two things, and I worry that this is just kind of like political science, I don't want to sound too boring, but the two things are expertise, the value of expertise. The public needs to recruit experts in order to successfully serve public purposes. Whether those purposes have a conservative inflection, liberal inflection, or there's some combination, interesting combination of the two, we need full-time PhDs in economics at the Bureau of Labor Statistics, thinking carefully about how to measure job growth and unemployment if we're going to make good decisions about how to manage the economy. And that is not partisan. So the nonpartisan character of expertise is something we need to rebuild. And the second thing is process, a commitment to impersonal process. I hate to say it, almost bureaucratic process. But say I want to offer a new course. I don't call the registrar and say, yo, Eric, got a new course idea. What do you think? And if, Eric's in good mood, or if I leave a turkey on his door on Thanksgiving morning, he's like, yeah, you got it, Muirhead, we'll put the course in. You want to introduce a course, you got to upload the form, you got to send it this thing, it gets approved by the chair, it gets approved by the divisional dean, it goes to the registrar, it goes to committee on instruction, da-da-da-da-da. There's a process for getting it. So I'm not dependent on any one person's will. And I'm dependent on a process. And not all my course ideas do get approved. But we have to defend this idea of process alongside the idea of expertise. Because that's fundamental to, both of those are fundamental to a government that works.
I'm going to close with this is not really a question, but an expression of thanks for your advocacy and an embrace of the values of patience, tolerance, humility, and service to others. I think this has been a great program, and we're all lucky that you're here. And I would urge people to read your book. I've read it a couple of times. Thank you very much.
Thank you.